Did you know that a single train can carry enough fuel to level an entire town? What if that train, filled with thousands of gallons of crude oil, suddenly went out of control in the dead of night? This isn't a scene from a movie, it's a real-life nightmare that struck the town of Lac-Mégantic. How did a quiet evening turn into a deadly inferno? What went so terribly wrong? Join us as we dive into the shocking events of that fateful night and uncover the chain of mistakes that led to a disaster no one saw coming. Before we dive into the background of this tragic train disaster, I invite you to subscribe this channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our train disaster documentaries. Lac-Mégantic is a small town in eastern Canada with a population of 5,747 people as of 2023. It's located about 130 miles east of Montreal and 87 miles south of Quebec City, close to the U.S. border. In 2013, the rail line running through Lac-Mégantic was owned by the Montreal, Maine and Atlantic Railway, MMA, a freight company based in Maine, USA. MMA bought the rail line in 2003 after the previous owner, Iron Road Railways, went bankrupt. Back then, the rail line was 745 miles long. After taking over, MMA made major budget cuts. They replaced train crews with remote controls for some trains and reduced the maintenance budget. These cuts led to safety problems, with MMA having an average of 36.1 accidents per 1 million miles traveled, more than twice the North American average of 14.6. The cost-cutting also led to reduced train services, which caused customers to leave, and large parts of the line were abandoned. By early 2013, the rail line was reduced to 510 miles. In Lac-Mégantic, there was a small rail yard just east of the downtown area. Trains that needed to bypass the yard had to navigate a sharp turn either to the northwest or the east, forming a triangle of tracks. At the time of the accident, the northwest turn had a speed limit of 10 miles per hour. MMA2 was a long tanker train, measuring 1,433 meters in length and weighing 10,287 metric tons. The train included a leading locomotive, a VB car, a former freight car modified to hold equipment for remote control, 4 helper locomotives, a boxcar used as a safety buffer, and 72 tank cars. Each tank car was filled with 113,000 liters, or 30,000 U.S. gallons of crude oil. The train was hired by World Fuel Services to transport crude oil from North Dakota, USA, to the Irving Oil Refinery in New Britain, the early hours of July 5, 2013. MMA2 left the CPR yard in Côte-Saint-Luc and headed toward Farnham in Quebec, where it stopped for a crew change at an MMA yard. There, the train was taken over by Mr. Harding, who drove it to a planned crew change point in the town of Nantes, located about 6.8 miles west-northwest of Lac-Mégantic. By the time Harding reached Nantes, he had reached his duty time limit, so the train had to stop there. At 11 p.m., Harding parked the train on the main line track, shut down locomotives 2 through 5, and set the brakes. The train had to be parked on the main line because MMA had reserved the local siding for freight cars headed to a particle board factory in Lac-Mégantic. While it was unusual to leave a train unattended on the main line, there were no rules or laws against it. The siding, however, had a safety feature called a derailer, which would derail any unauthorized train movement. The main line, where the train was parked, did not have this safety feature. After parking the train, Mr. Harding applied several handbrakes, though the exact number would become a key issue after the accident. He also engaged the train's pneumatic brakes. The reason he couldn't shut down locomotive 5217 was that its engine was needed to power the compressor, which maintained the air pressure necessary for the pneumatic brakes to stay applied. Without this pressure, the brakes would eventually release. Once he secured the train, Mr. Harding contacted the rail traffic controller in Farnham to report that everything was in order. He also informed the rail traffic controller in Bangor, Maine, about some mechanical problems he noticed during the trip. He explained that locomotive 5017 had been emitting a lot of black and white smoke and was surging uncontrollably, making it hard to maintain a steady speed. It was decided that these issues would be dealt with in the morning, and in the meantime, number 5017 would keep idling to ensure the compressor continued running. Mr. Harding was then picked up by a taxi driven by Mr. Turcotte, who took him to the Hotel L'Auberge in downtown Lac-Mégantic. During the ride, Mr. Harding expressed his concern about leaving the locomotive running unattended, especially since it was leaking oil and producing a lot of black smoke. Mr. Turcotte later recalled that Mr. Harding was covered in droplets of oil, which he also noticed on his taxi's windshield. When they arrived at the hotel, Mr. Harding mentioned that he would call MMA's U.S. office, as their instructions would take priority over those from the traffic controllers. At 11:50 p.m., the Nantes Fire Department received a call from a local resident who reported seeing flames on locomotive 5017. When the firefighters arrived, they confirmed that there was a fire on the main body of the locomotive. Following standard procedures, they entered the cab and shut off the locomotive, cutting off the fuel supply to the engine, which they suspected was burning. As the local fire chief, Mr. Lambert, later explained, this was necessary to prevent the locomotive from continuing to pump fuel into the fire, which would have made their job harder. The firefighters quickly put out the fire and then notified MMA's traffic controller in Farnham, asking them to send the driver back to the train. MMA refused, explaining that Mr. Harding couldn't return yet because he needed to complete a mandatory rest period. Instead, they sent 2 track maintenance workers who were not trained in operating the train. These workers arrived and confirmed that the train was safe around 12:45 a.m. on July 6, 2013. After that, the workers, along with the remaining firefighters and police officers who had been guarding the train, left the scene. With the locomotive shut down, the compressor could no longer maintain the air pressure needed for the pneumatic brakes. As the pressure slowly dropped, the brakes eventually released enough that the heavy train, parked on a slight downhill slope, could no longer stay in place. Around 12:56 a.m., the train began to move, despite the handbrakes. At 1 a.m., a passerby saw the train moving slowly along the tracks. They later described how there was no engine sound and no lights on the train. Because the rail line didn't have any sensors to detect train movement, the dispatch center remained unaware that the train was moving, as no one reported it. Shortly after, Mr. Montminy, one of the firefighters who had helped extinguish the fire on locomotive 5017, came across an active level crossing on Quebec Route 161, not far from where the fire had been. He waited at the crossing but didn't see or hear any sign of an approaching train. No engine sounds or horn blasts that are usually heard when a train nears a crossing in Canada. Thinking the crossing signal was malfunctioning, he cautiously drove across the tracks. Just as he made it to the other side, an unlit train sped past in complete silence, except for the noise of the wheels. There was no horn, no engine sound, nothing. Mr. Montminy quickly realized it was the same train he had just worked on less than an hour earlier. Alarmed, he turned around and rushed back to the fire station to tell his colleagues what he had witnessed. Meanwhile, the train continued to gain speed as it traveled downhill. Later calculations estimated it was moving at 65 mph when it entered Lac-Mégantic at 1:13 a.m. Witnesses in the town saw the train speeding by, making an infernal noise with sparks flying from the wheels, but without any headlights. At that moment, Mr. Flouet was leaving the Musique Café in downtown Lac-Mégantic. By chance, he walked away from the rail line and narrowly missed being hit by the train by about 50 meters. He later recalled, "It was moving at a hellish speed. No lights, no signals, nothing at all. There was no warning. It was a black blob that came out of nowhere. I realized they were oil tankers and they were going to blow up, so I yelled that to my friends and got out of there. If we had stayed where we were, we would have been roasted." At 1:14 a.m., the train sped across Frontenac Street, the main street in town, without even triggering the crossing signals. It then approached a set of points at the start of a sharp right turn toward the local yard, moving at more than 6 times the speed limit. Predictably, the train had no chance of making it through the turn without derailing. By some miracle, the locomotives managed to make it through the turn, but the tanker cars didn't. they tore off at the coupler and flew off the tracks, unable to handle the sharp turn. Some of the derailing tank cars immediately ruptured, releasing a massive wave of oil that was instantly ignited by sparks and heat from the train's wheels. This created what witnesses described as a tsunami of oil and fire. The initial explosion shot flames 3 times higher than the surrounding buildings, with witnesses reporting 4 to 6 more explosions soon after. At the nearby Musi Cafe, guests felt the ground shake, with some thinking it was an earthquake. In a panic, some people ran outside, while others were convinced by the staff to take cover under the tables. Tragically, most of those who ran didn't survive, unable to escape the fiery flood sweeping through the town. Those who stayed inside had a better chance, with many managing to escape before the building was completely engulfed in flames. A total of 63 out of the 72 tank cars derailed, spilling about 6 million liters of oil. The emergency status escalated rapidly, with over 150 firefighters from both Quebec, Canada, and Maine, USA, called in to help. The local hospital declared a code orange, a plan designed to handle many severe injuries, but tragically there were few injured survivors. The worst injury was a customer from the Musi Cafe, who suffered second-degree burns on his arm. Around 1,000 people were forced to evacuate their homes due to the fire, and another 1,000 had to leave later because of the toxic smoke that lingered in the streets. Amid the chaos, a volunteer firefighter managed to uncouple the rear 9 undamaged tank cars, hoping to tow them to safety. Mr. Harding, along with 2 workers from the local particle board factory, used a dual-mode vehicle to pull 5 of the cars away. However, they couldn't find another crossing to move their vehicle around the cars to retrieve the remaining 4. By early afternoon, the firefighters managed to contain the fire and prevent it from spreading further. At that point, their focus shifted to fully extinguishing the blaze. However, the area where the fire started remained inaccessible for 20 hours after the accident, as 5 pools of burning oil continued to generate intense heat, keeping responders at a safe distance. 5 unexploded tank cars were cooled down with water to prevent them from exploding, while 2 continued to burn even 36 hours after the derailment. The fire department finally reported that the fire was fully extinguished by the following evening, just a few hours short of the blaze lasting for 2 full days. A total of 42 bodies were recovered from the remains of the downtown area and sent to Montreal for identification. By late August, 39 of the victims had been identified, and the 40th was identified by April 2014. The identification process relied heavily on DNA samples provided by relatives, along with dental records, if those had survived the fire. Unfortunately, 5 residents remained missing and were eventually declared deceased, with no remains ever found. In total, 30 buildings were lost in the fire, including the library, post office, bank, and several homes, wiping out 115 businesses and multiple private residences. The town's drinking water supply had to be shut down as oil had leaked into it, making it unsafe to drink. Tanker trucks were brought in to provide drinking water until the water system could be repaired. Even after the repairs, a warning remained in place advising residents to only consume boiled water. Investigators retrieved the data logger from the lead locomotive and examined the remaining part of the train. They found that all the handbrakes had been applied, and the wheels were noticeably blue, a sign of extreme heat caused by the brakes being applied too hard or for too long while the train was moving. The report also mentioned that the coupler between the second and third locomotives was broken, with a cable pinched inside it. This suggested that the locomotives had separated at some point, but reconnected when the rear locomotives caught up. Before any official investigations by Quebec or the Federal Transportation Safety Board, TSB, could present their findings, MMA announced that Mr. Harding, the engineer, would be suspended for not properly setting the brakes on the train. Following his lawyer's advice, Mr. Harding refused to speak to the media, police, or TSB, while MMA instructed all employees not to talk to the police without a company lawyer present. Mr. Lafontaine, who lost 3 close relatives and an employee in the disaster, voiced his concerns about the neglected state of MMA's rail lines and the increasing number of dangerous goods being transported through the town. Just days after the accident, on July 8th, police called TSB investigators and Transport Canada employees to inspect an MMA train parked on a downhill section of track near Frontenac, Quebec. The train had been sitting there since July 5th with the engine running and a cab door left open. It was discovered that only 5 handbrakes had been set, even though regulations required 9 on level ground and even more on a slope. This incident shifted the investigation's focus to the train's brakes. Investigators calculated that MMA-2 would have needed 146,700 pounds of braking force to stay in place on the downhill track at Nantes. The pneumatic brakes on the train could theoretically provide up to 249,760 pounds of braking power, but faulty valves on the second locomotive, along with non-standard repair attempts, reduced this to about 215,500 pounds. According to guidelines, at least 15 tank cars should have had their handbrakes set on level ground, but investigators found that only 7 had been applied. On the sloped track at Nantes, at least 17 handbrakes were needed, yet the train was relying almost entirely on pneumatic brakes. With just 7 handbrakes set, the combined braking power was only 48,600 pounds, less than a third of what was needed to keep the train in place. Typically, a train driver would test the handbrakes by releasing the pneumatic brakes while disconnecting the compressor. However, Mr. Harding left the compressor connected, so when he released the air pressure, the system immediately refilled, giving a false sense of braking power. It's unclear why Mr. Harding only applied half the required hand brakes. Since he refused to talk to investigators, they couldn't determine if he forgot, miscalculated, or thought it wasn't necessary. The main cause of the accident was the application of insufficient brakes. 2 days before the accident, another driver reported issues with locomotive 5017, noticing sudden engine surges, brief spikes or drops in RPM, and informed the maintenance facility in Darby, Canada. The problem was considered not serious enough to remove the locomotive from service or prevent it from leading trains, which is why 5017 was at the front of MMA-2 on the day of the accident. When Mr. Harding took over, he experienced the same issues. The engine couldn't maintain a steady RPM at full throttle, produced excessive smoke from the exhaust, and ejected oil droplets after stopping in Nantes. Concerned, Mr. Harding contacted his superiors, who told him he could leave the faulty locomotive running until morning. This decision not only made him uneasy, but also directly violated MMA's safety guideline 9126, which states, "When there is an abnormal condition such as noise, smoke, or odor coming from the engine should be shut down. Employees must immediately leave the engine room and shut down the engine using the emergency shutdown button at the control stand, control panel, or fueling location on either side of the locomotive." The root cause of the problem was revealed. A bearing on the camshaft, which controls the opening and closing of the engine's valves, had fractured because its mounting bolt was over-tightened. In their final report, published on August 19, 2014, the Transportation Safety Board, TSB, identified 18 factors that combined to cause the accident. One of the main issues was MMA's weak and insufficient safety culture, which led to a quick and cheap repair being applied to the damaged engine on 5017. Ultimately, all these theories were disproven. However, the investigation revealed that the oil, which came from the Bakken oil field in North Dakota, was not properly identified in the shipping papers. This Bakken oil contained unusually high levels of hydrogen sulfide gas, a flammable, corrosive, poisonous, and explosive substance. This is why the oil ignited so quickly and burned so intensely. As a result of the investigation, Transport Canada took a closer look at MMA's tracks and found that 6 parts of their rail line didn't meet basic safety standards. Even more concerning, they discovered a section with a high number of faulty sleepers, railroad ties, near a propane storage facility. Faulty sleepers are dangerous because they can cause the rails to spread apart, leading to derailments. As we reflect on this tragedy, it's important to consider the broader implications. What can be done to prevent something like this from happening again? How do we ensure that those in positions of responsibility are held accountable? And how do we support the victims and communities affected by such disasters? We want to hear your thoughts. What do you think should have been done differently? How can we improve safety standards to protect our communities in the future? Please share your comments below, and let's start a meaningful conversation about how we can learn from this tragedy and work towards a safer future for everyone.